Hello everyone, today we keep on reading and commenting on the second chapter of the first book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege. The text follows. The second question is how to act upon the enemy's expenditure in strength, that is, to raise the price of success. The enemy's outlay in strength lies in the wear and tear of his forces, consequently in the destruction of them on our part, and in the loss of provinces, consequently the conquest of them by us. Here again, on account of the various significations of these means, so likewise it will be found that neither of them will be identical in its signification in all cases if the objects are different. The smallness in general of this difference must not cause us perplexity, for in reality the weakest motives, the finest shades of difference, often decide in favor of this or that method of applying force. Our only business here is to show that, certain conditions being supposed, the possibility of attaining our purpose in different ways is no contradiction, absurdity, nor even error. Besides these two means, there are three other peculiar ways of directly increasing the waste of the enemy's force. The first is invasion, that is, the occupation of the enemy's territory, not with a view to keeping it, but in order to leave contributions upon it or to devastate it. The immediate object here is neither the conquest of the enemy's territory nor the defeat of his armed force, but merely to do him damage in a general way. The second way is to select for the object of our enterprises those points at which we can do the enemy most harm. Nothing is easier to conceive than two different directions in which our force may be employed, the first of which is to be preferred if our object is to defeat the enemy's army, while the other is more advantageous if the defeat of the enemy is out of the question. According to the usual mode of speaking, we should say that the first is primarily military, the other more political. But if we take our view from the highest point, both are equally military, and neither the one nor the other can be eligible unless it suits the circumstances of the case. The third, by far the most important, from the great number of cases which it embraces, is the wearing out of the enemy. We choose this expression not only to explain our meaning in few words, but because it represents the thing exactly, and is not so figurative as may at first appear. The idea of wearing out in a struggle amounts in practice to a gradual exhaustion of the physical powers and of the will by the long continuance of exertion. Now, if we want to overcome the enemy by the duration of the contest, we must content ourselves with as small objects as possible, for it is in the nature of the thing that a great end requires a greater expenditure of force than a small one. But the smallest object that we can propose to ourselves is simple passive resistance, that is, a combat without any positive view. In this way, therefore, our means attain their greatest relative value, and therefore the result is best secured. How far now can this negative mode of proceeding be carried? Plainly not to absolute passivity, for mere endurance would not be fighting, and the defensive is an activity by which so much of the enemy's power must be destroyed that he must give up his object. That alone is what we aim at in each single act, and therein consists the negative nature of our object. No doubt, this negative object in its single act is not so effective as the positive object in the same direction would be, supposing it successful. But there is this difference in its favor, that it succeeds more easily than the positive, and therefore it holds out greater certainty of success. What is wanting in the efficacy of its single act must be gained through time, that is, through the duration of the contest, and therefore this negative intention, which constitutes the principle of the pure defensive, is also the natural means of overcoming the enemy by the duration of the combat, that is, of wearing him out. Here lies the origin of that difference of offensive and defensive, the influence of which prevails throughout the whole province of war. We cannot at present pursue this subject further than to observe that from this negative intention are to be deduced all the advantages and all the stronger forms of combat which are on the side of the defensive, and in which that philosophical dynamic law which exists between the greatness and the certainty of success is realized. We shall resume the consideration of this hereafter. If then the negative purpose, that is, the concentration of all the means into a state of pure resistance, affords a superiority in the contest, and if this advantage is sufficient to balance whatever superiority in numbers the adversary may have, then the mere duration of the contest will suffice gradually to bring the loss of force on the party of the adversary to a point at which the political object can no longer be an equivalent, a point at which, therefore, he must give up the contest. We see, then, that this class of means, the wearing out of the enemy, includes the great number of cases in which the weaker resists the stronger. Frederick the Great, during the 7 Years' War, was never strong enough to overthrow the Austrian monarchy, and if he had tried to do so after the fashion of Charles XII, he would inevitably have had to succumb himself. But after his skilful application of the system of husbanding his resources had shown the powers allied against him through a 7 years' struggle that the actual expenditure of strength far exceeded what they had at first anticipated, they made peace. We see, then, that there are many ways to one's object in war, that complete subjugation of the enemy is not essential in every case, that the destruction of the enemy's military force, the conquest of the enemy's provinces, the mere occupation of them, the mere invasion of them, enterprises which are aimed directly at the political objects, lastly, a passive expectation of the enemy's blow, are all means which, each in itself, may be used to force the enemy's will according as the peculiar circumstances of the case led us to expect more from one or the other. We could still add to these a whole category of shorter methods of gaining the end, which might be called arguments ad hominem. What branch of human affairs is there in which these sparks of individual spirit have not made their appearance, surmounting all formal considerations? And least of all can they fail to appear in war, where the personal character of the combatants plays such an important part, both in the cabinet and in the field. We limit ourselves to pointing this out, as it would be pedantry to attempt to reduce such influences into classes. Including these, we may say that the number of possible ways of reaching the object rises to infinity. To avoid underestimating these different short roads to one's purpose, either estimating them only as rare exceptions or holding the difference which they cause in the conduct of war as insignificant, we must bear in mind the diversity of political objects which may cause a war, measure at a glance the distance which there is between a dead struggle for political existence and a war which a force of tottering alliance makes a mattering of disagreeable duty. Between the two innumerable gradations occurring in practice, if we reject one of these gradations in theory, we might, with equal right, reject the whole, which would be tantamount to shutting the real world completely out of sight. So, rather long text today, nevertheless something now very, very important as always, but more than the usual, I would say, because here the author introduces dramatically important elements to his theory. So basically this passage is set to answer the question how to basically make the enemy expand its forces, its strengths, and therefore increasing our chance of success. So here the definition is that the enemy's outlay in strength lies effectively in the wear and tear of his forces, consequently in the destruction of them on our part, and in the loss of provinces, consequently the conquest of them by us, right? So in other words, we have first of all to annihilate its strengths, but we also have to ensure that this opponent cannot gather basically other resources by controlling them. So in this case, by conquering his country. So this is still in the realm of absolute, if you want. So von Clausewitz says here again, on account of the various significations of these means, so likewise it will be found that neither of them will be identical in its signification in all cases if the objects are different. So here he brings us back to the relative reality, that is fundamentally that all of these ways that we have listed in order to make the enemy exhaust his strengths are differently modulated according to the various objects that we have, and naturally also that the enemy partly has, because there is law of reciprocity that fundamentally we can't always play even with the greatest advantage at our total wish. I mean, in the measure, in the conditions that make us absolutely favorable, because in that realm we wouldn't be even in physical reality, right? So yeah, then von Clausewitz says the smallness in general of this difference must not cause us perplexity, for in reality the weakest motives, the finest shades of difference, often decide in favor of this or that method of applying force. So in other words, most of this of real war is fundamentally about reducing this absolute and having to deal with kind of lesser degrees of force, exertion, and of radicality, I would say, that that are usually not even necessary, actually. Then he goes on, says, our only business here is to show that certain conditions being supposed, the possibility of attaining our purpose in different ways is no contradiction, absurdity, nor even error. So in other words, he's telling us now, I will show you that here exclusively that basically there is no contradiction, absurdity, or error if there is this reduction from the of the absolute dimension to a relative one. So there is no contradiction. Actually, von Clausewitz had already pointed this out before, so here is going more in detail, but the concept is the one that we already observed in the first chapter, that is, it's obvious that we can't fight with an unrestrained use of force, or in the conditions that best suit us. That there is always, and also for the sake of not maybe just because of fear of the enemy, but also for economical reasons of our own, something that makes this the combination of these options changing. So we will see now that wearing and tearing the enemy forces, or and therefore destroying them, or making him lose some parts of his country, or the conquest of the country in its total, is something that can be let's say aimed at without in different ways, by separating them all according to the various needs that we have that can change. Maybe a war can start by simply wanting to take over an enemy province, and it ends by needing to annihilate the whole enemy army that has been mobilized. Maybe we didn't expect it would happen. So this is particularly important. This is just already an example to make you understand better what's the point here. So here it says, besides these two means that we have listed, there are three other peculiar ways of directly increasing the waste of the enemy's force. So the first is invasion. That is the occupation of the enemy's territory, not with a view of keeping it, but in order to levy contributions upon it or to devastate it. So this first one is invading an enemy country, not because you really want to occupy there, to remain there, but simply to cause some damage or to gain force on your own, by the way, by pillaging it, by devastating it, so stealing in part also the enemy's resources for your keeping them from him and for yourself. So here it says the immediate object here in this case of invasion is neither the conquest of the enemy's territory nor the defeat of his armed force. So we don't care. We just have to make this kind of hit and run, broadly speaking, in a strategical sense, but merely which is aimed, as Clausewitz says, to do the enemy damage in a general way. So this is clear, right? You know, if this is very elementary. Think about all raiding warfare. I mean, most of warfare, historically speaking, this is what it's been about: raiding enemy territory, so damaging it, and getting away with loot, and having gained something, and having made the enemy lose something else. Then it says, Von Clausewitz goes on, says, the second way is to select for the object of our enterprises those points at which we can do the enemy most harm. Nothing is easier to conceive than two different directions in which our force may be employed. The first one is the defeat of the enemy army, while the other one, which is more advantageous if the defeat of the enemy is out of question. So, in other words, here it says, let's go on for a while. It says, according to the usual mode of speaking, we should say that the first is primarily military, the other more political. So, in other words, from one side you can decide to annihilate, literally, the whole enemy army, the armed forces, broadly meant. The other way you can achieve this is by hitting the hardest, let's say, and here we approach to certain important concepts. When the enemy is going to suffer the most as a consequence, where he's going to get more harm. So here von Clausewitz is saying, essentially, if you look at these two ways, we see that definitely one has here it's put in relative terms, a more military and a more political, respectively, character. Because essentially the first one is really intended to commit more force, right? If you really want to destroy the enemy's army, I mean, at least in general, because this is always in relative terms, but given kind of equal ground, destroying the whole enemy army is something that, I mean, think it always in reality, like in military history, any kind of war you can think of. It's something that takes a lot of energies away, right? Most of the times, as we have already seen in Vom Kriege, that's not even the objective of war, of real war, of the relative wars that are being fought in reality, right? So, and it's usually something imposant, because you literally have to go out there in face of the enemy, or at least, well, maybe also in other ways, but on a broader strategical level, it's obvious that you have to clash with an enemy pretty strongly, face to face, or you can employ your means that are still military. This is particularly important, but to hit in a place where you're gonna harming the enemy consistently, but without at that point really having to wipe out the enemy military by destroying it directly. You can do it in an indirect way that obviously has to do, in this sense, more with the political aspect side of the story, because that harm is conceived to basically to make the enemy desisting from continuing the operation, so that you don't really have to knock out the enemy army physically, but you can make policy where it's controlling that army, not employing it or having problems to do it, right? So that's why von Clausewitz is giving this character, right? And he is, however, pointing out that as he rightfully says, and here I repeat it, but if we take our view from the highest point, both are equally military, right? Because you're still using a military mean. The way that we have listed is this kind of one. And neither the one nor the other can be eligible unless it suits the circumstances of the case. So this is also another important reminder that this choice, whether to go one way or the other, is always dictated by the circumstances. So you can't say, I have to and do only this or only that. And every real war is basically both things at the same time, actually, just in different degrees, but also in varying degrees. This is particularly important. It never changes. I mean, in a war, the option whether to now we'll see, do particular damage in different ways, in multiple ways. It's like, just like a stupid, but not so stupid example. If you have a major battle, a major war, you have a front line where all divisions are fighting in the so-called conventional way, let's say that in open ground with one in front face of the other. And then you carry out many, both sides actually can carry out surgical operations with, special forces out there behind the enemy lines, right? So hitting the hardest, maybe at, some supply depots or other stuff that is used by the army, etc., or even causing actually damage physically to the army itself. Maybe you will kill not just the guards of those supplies, but maybe knock out in the process other units and all the stuff. So you realize that it's both of the options are military, but they happen at the same time, and they have a sort of different, a more or less surgical, let's say, level of action that is mostly not just suiting to those particular circumstances, but also dictated by the circumstances, because doctrinally speaking, it's not that you can't do really in so-called conventional conflict that you can't do without entire armies going out there and dealing in open ground. You can't win a war just through that kind of war through special forces operations. I know it's a banal example, but it still gets to the point of how hybrid the nature is. And frankly, what is interesting about this is that there is a sort of middle ground that you can't even circumscribe in its boundaries, where, how can you decide which one is really, how can you differentiate that? Because even you can use a division in a particular task that is aimed here at making most harm to the enemy, not really having this immediate object of wiping out the enemy army in just one shot, but by fighting against it directly, right? So it's relatively blurred, but let's say that it swings between these two extremes, and it always changes in war, so that you can't give it a direction, but it's still, it's going to be modified. But this is not what now. Here we get to a third way. Says von Clausewitz says the third, by far the most important way, from the great number of cases which it embraces, is the wearing out of the enemy. And then he says, we choose this expression not only to explain our meaning in few words, but because it represents the thing exactly as wearing out, in fact, and is not so figurative as may at first appear. So it's really actually what happens. And the idea, he says, of wearing out in a struggle amounts in practice to a gradual exhaustion of the physical powers and of the will by the long continuance of exertion. So this goes far beyond, and you realize that even this third way is mixed with the others, because even trying to wipe out an enemy army in its operations of doing surgical hits, etc., it's a way to wear out, to exhaust, to, if anything, getting alert. A state of alert, but already by itself is something that exhausts, that consumes at least enemy energies. So it's all one, right? So this is a kind of another trinity that we identified, but it's particularly important to bear in mind. So the idea here is that you can gradually exhaust the enemy without even directly committing your forces in that sense. I mean, even making them move from a certain point of view is a way to do it. And this is just because we live in a physical world where, there is attrition. You can't do anything about that. Sources of let's say energy in itself are limited, and you can't go on forever without getting new resources, new strengths, and this is in a nutshell how it works. Then it says, now, if we want to overcome the enemy by the duration of the contest, we must content ourselves with a small object, with as small objects as possible, for it is in the nature of the thing that a great end requires a greater expenditure of force than a small one. So this is self-explanatory, right? So if we really want just time to overcome the enemy, we have to stay there in a relative passive way. Now, in the next phrase, we will see better what this is about. For as in the nature of the thing that a great end requires a greater expenditure of force than a small one. So, but the smallest object that we can propose to ourselves by just sitting there waiting is simple passive resistance. That is a combat without any positive view. In this way, therefore, our means attain their greatest relative value, and therefore the result is best secured. How far now can this negative mode of proceeding be carried? Plainly, not to absolute passivity, for mere endurance would not be fighting. This is a key point. I mean, yeah, you can't sit there and watch, but fundamentally that would just leave the initiative to the enemy, and if you really don't want really to do anything, you're simply gonna be overcome, and this is naturally not what you want to happen. Says, and the defensive is an activity by which so much of the enemy's power must be destroyed that he must give up his object. That alone is what we aim at in each single act, and therein consists the negative nature of our object. So in here we have looked at the what's effectively the negative object of defense in itself as the strongest form of war, but once again with the negative object, that is to say, we basically wait. And it has pros and cons in general, but in the Clausewitzian theory we have seen that in absolute terms defensive is the stronger form of war. That is, in many ways, what it says to do here is that you have to exploit your passivity, so the preservation of our forces, to strike back. Now I'm saying it by myself, but say, however, in that measure that affords you by the edge given by defense to the enemy that is exerting his forces in the process of at least having gotten there to come and get you, in your defensive position, right? So von Clausewitz goes on and says, no doubt this negative object in its single act is not so effective as the positive object in the same direction would be, supposing it successful. But there is this difference in its favor, that it succeeds more easily than the positive, and therefore it holds out greater certainty of success. What is wanting in the efficacy of its single act must be gained through time, that is, through the duration of the contest, and therefore this negative intention, which constitutes the principle of the pure defensive, is also the natural means of overcoming the enemy by the duration of the combat that is wearing him out. So here it's saying, no doubt that theoretically at least, the attacker, the offender, is the one who has its positive object, for which, if it succeeds, he has gained more than the defender, because the defender at that point has a negative object because he's just trying to stop what the enemy is doing. He's not going to take the next step. I mean, obviously it can as long, but in that moment he becomes an attacker, an offender in turn. So he changes, he switches, say, from the other side. And just bear in mind that all wars are like this. There's always the defender and the attacker that switch, side continuously, given the ratios, relation of strengths that entails in the initiative, and in fact in all this. So all the game of war is played in this sense. Pure defensive has this theoretically pure negative intention, which actually in its absolute extreme does not exist, because it would be not reacting at all, but it's based fundamentally in wearing the enemy out during a combat from this position that is favorable, because it basically preserves your own energies and obviously gives you more strength to use than if you were attacking like the other guy is doing. So that on average he is in proportion, let's say he's wasting more than you do, at least given a completely abstract situation, because there are situations in which even the defender, by idling, maybe he's consuming resources, or maybe he's not seizing another opportunity that could make him stronger, right? So this is not always true. It's always relative. It's like what we were saying before, according to what it suits best. But this is the mechanism in how it happens, right? And it's always reciprocal, by the way, because you need a defender to have an attacker, and vice versa. So that's exactly in the middle where you can play on it, given this. However, on average, defense has the edge over the attack. So in other words, this negative object that we have just defined is usually the one with the from which the fighter gains the greater advantage at the moment. So in other words, the attack is also much more related to the attacker has evidently a stronger motive than the defender, right? On average as well. So that's where the positivity of the object comes into place, because he's attacking for something that goes beyond the fight against the defender. It's like the objective beyond the obstacle, right? The defender is staying there in the middle and says, I won't let you pass, right? I will try to exploit my edge of staying firm in here and see you consuming resources while you try to pass, right? This is where the whole thing really lays, and it's particularly important. And that's why, in fact, von Clausewitz says, here lies the origin of that difference of offensive and defensive, the influence of which prevails throughout the whole province of war. So in other words, as we've just defined, in war is all about the relation between the offensive and the defensive. And there is no way out of it. It's mathematical. It's reciprocal. There is no way out of it. Von Clausewitz says, we cannot at present pursue this subject further than to observe that from this negative intention are to be deduced all the advantages and all the stronger forms of combat which are on the side of the defensive, and in which that philosophical dynamic law which exists between the greatness and the certainty of success is realized. And then he says, we shall resume the consideration of this hereafter, and it will, obviously, but this is crucial. This last passage is really crucial, because it really tells you that the defensive in itself is really, in its negative intention, deduces all the advantages in the stronger forms of combat, and makes you, this gives you this edge, confers to you this, the greatness that lays between the greatness and the certainty of success, right? So this law, which von Clausewitz calls that is inescapable, and this always happens like in the same old way. So this is particularly important. This is once again theory and practice, theory and practice at the same time. That is to say that obviously a defender can be defeated. He may even have a huge advantage and still be defeated by an attacker. So it doesn't mean that the defender always wins, which is obvious. But it also tells you that in the relation between these two attackers, there is an advantage in the offensive and a disadvantage, a disadvantage in the offensive and an advantage in the defensive that cannot be eliminated as long as that relation stays in place, right? Is standing there. So that's how it is. That's how war is, and it all revolves arguably around this. And I would say, if you are acquainted with military history in general, you know how even to sense this weight. I mean, to understand, I don't know, that an assault to a particularly well-defended position is madness. It's full of examples in history of misjudgment, of terrible mistakes, and most of these have to do with this relation. Actually, they all have to do with this relation, but most of them have to do with this greater edge given by defense, in fact, that needs to be broken. I would say, I'm not entirely sure of this, but I think the greatest mistakes have to do with the overconfidence of the attacker. Indeed, because the attack in itself is way more risky than the defense in itself. Also because the defense provides you with a situation of greater order, of lesser dispersion of forces. So in other ways, you can concentrate better the attack. We will see this further in the Vom Kriege when, for example, von Clausewitz talks about two armies that simultaneously attack each other, right? So this doesn't really mean that at the end there is not an attacker or defender, because if you look with, into detail, that's already happening somewhere in the relation. But it's particularly interesting because it tells you that the attacker is shaky, and it turns out that when two armies attack, it's not like in physics that they hit the hardest. Not at all. They tend to slow down with the attack, and they're very uncomfortable in that position because they know that it's messy, that they're dispersing more forces as attackers. Whereas the bloodiest engagements, the one when more people die. Look at Pickett's charge at Gettysburg, just to make an example. Where that's you see the bloodbath, right? Where you see the greatest amount of massacre, of kills, because you have a defender that is there standing, and you have an attacker that basically crushes himself into it. So that's the type of combat that has the most dramatic outcome in many ways, and that therefore is also kind of more echoing. There are way more famous military episodes relative to that than to two armies kind of attacking each other simultaneously, right? It's a question of numbers, right? Because those relations are entailed. But this was just a digression. Maybe we will get to that, of course, at one point. Then the Clausewitz goes on and says, if then the negative purpose, that is the concentration of all the means into a state of pure resistance, affords a superiority in the contest, as we have seen, and if this advantage is sufficient to balance whatever superiority numbers the adversary may have, then the mere duration of the contest will suffice gradually to bring the loss of force on the part of the adversary to a point at which the political object can no longer be an equivalent, a point at which, therefore, he must give up the contest. Now, this is like a mathematical equation, right? Basically, it tells you that if the edge conferred by defensive, by the negative purpose, wherever you want to call it, is sufficient to, at least to balance, so basically to neutralize, not even to counter-strike in this sense, the actively from the side of the defense. So let's assume it was kind of even a minimal defense, right? So in order to balance the superiority of numbers the adversary may have, then that's the moment in which really Times is able to wear out the enemy, let's say the attacker proper at this point, that is gonna make him give up at one point. Because basically, if you are gonna attack someone and you see that someone is obviously in defense, is waiting for you, and you realize that you don't have an advantage at that point anymore because his negative purpose gives him that better edge, well, at that point, maybe, yeah, you can try to get there, to get better data, to try something, but at one point you have to give up. Right, and you have to give up this, as always, not just as a military action, but even also as a political one, because as we've said before, the attacker has this positive object, this positive purpose that is already looking beyond the obstacle, and that is driving him, so that the defender is just an accident along his, between him and the objective, the final objective that at that point is eminently political, because it goes beyond the armored force of the enemy is standing there to stop him. So it's actually policy that gives that up at that point, because otherwise you would just send that army to be slaughtered, fundamentally, or to in this case of perfect balance, but it's obviously absurd to neutralize both forces, both yours and the ones of the enemy, but obviously, and this is something that may happen in the sense that there are historically certain bloodbaths for which, think about the so-called Pyrrhic victories that obviously are not a perfect neutralization, but it's a situation in which you have lost so much on the ground, so tactically speaking, that even on a strategical level you're saying, well, I don't have any resources to commit at that point to attain that particular object that is political, right? So this is particularly important as well. In here, von Clausewitz adds very importantly that says, we see then that this class of means, the wearing out of the enemy, includes the great number of cases in which the weaker resists the stronger. So in the three ways that we have explained up to now, basically this is the wearing out the enemy, so not trying to destroy his by sheer duration, so not destroying his army directly or with use of force, or at least that minimal one that obviously this negative purpose entails. However, if in order to differentiate it from mere passivity, nor the occupation of his province, of his country, is the one in which basically the weaker resists more often than a stronger. And this is clear. We have explained it up to now. Why? Because the weaker is the defender at this point, and the stronger is an attacker. And defense is a stronger form of war. Attack is the weaker, right? And then here von Clausewitz makes a very interesting historical remark, military historical remark, of of the many he does, but this is kind of the most consistent we have met up to this point since the beginning. He says Frederick the Great, so Frederick II of Prussia, during the 7 Years' War, 1756-1763, just a reminder, was never strong enough to overthrow the Austrian monarchy. And this is true. I mean, Prussia wasn't so strong alone to defeat the Habsburgs. At that point, the Hohenzollern's simply didn't have enough strength. And Prussia was a kind of a, relatively emerging power at this point. So, and says if he, that is Frederick, had tried to do so after the fashion of Charles XII. Here he's talking about Charles XII of Sweden, that had invaded Russia at the beginning of the 18th century, passing through the Ukraine, having his army actually worn out and defeated at Poltava, and he would have had inevitably to succumb himself. So in other words, it says if Frederick the Great had basically left the nest provided by, usually it was Saxony or Silesia, etc., to just go out there in open ground against the Austrian army, into the core of Austrian, he would have been into the depth of Austrian terror. He would have been worn out and defeated, right? And Charles the 12th, back in the day, was particularly confident at that point that his army was a pretty strong one, which was because the Swedish army at the beginning of the 18th century was definitely the strongest army out there, and in Europe. And incidentally, that army was the Schwerpunkt of Sweden. The Russians think, well, they have weaker armored force, they have a weaker army, because it's kind of modernizing, westernizing progressively. Peter the Great makes this huge effort to make it, competitive, at least counting on numbers, chiefly more than quality, to defeat the Swedish army. But he understands that Charles the 12th had actually invaded Russia via the Ukraine. So crossing this very vast and enormous steps, so being worn out, constantly harassed by the Russian cavalry, etc. So basically making a big mistake, because it was wearing out at that point without a fight, at least up to Poltava. The elite, I mean the really what all his strength laid on. This is a very good case of a wearing out, right, by duration, because this pursuit of the Russian army through the Ukraine was by the Swedes was pretty long, right, up to around to Poltava, right. Obviously, the Russians had problems on their own at that point, but still they were advantaged by this strategical condition. And then there is the collapse of when the Swedish army is weakened enough. The Russians made it to defeat them. So, and that really changes the whole history of Sweden. That basically declines irreversibly, basically from that point onward. So, what von Clausewitz is saying there is that Frederick the Great was clever enough, exactly, not to do the same thing, but just to play on this kind of limited range that it doesn't really mean that it was always in defense, of course, but that broadly speaking was basically aiming at luring the Austrian forces at that point to a favorable ground for the Prussians, etc. It was, as you know, the 7 Years' War was one of the bloodiest wars out there. And by the way, the Prussian army had at this point this great quality that was a synonym of, of Prussian military, of discipline, of spirit of abnegation. The 7 Years' War is a bloodbath for the Prussian, especially for the officers of the Prussian military. This also causes a lot of political, social changes within the Prussian states. It actually helped to centralize even more in that period in history of the Prussian state and all. But strategically speaking, Prussia is in a freaking desperate situation. He has the French, the Austrians, and the Russians against him, and Prussia is too tiny. And there are in fact these so-called miracles of the House of Brandenburg, which is that on two different occasions, respectively, the French and the Russian army stopped before marching on to Berlin. And at the end of the story, obviously the 7 Years' War is basically won not in Europe but abroad. Is won chiefly in India, in North America. It's the British that defeat the French. They're incredibly passive from a strategical point of view, despite having a substantial strength. So that Prussia was allied with the Brits, basically wins the situation, the war, and also obtaining some territory by having effectively just having had a draw with all its enemies. That obviously, however, had an immediately a big advantage, but were not able to let's say go past, at least most of the times, this strictly military this edge given by the defensivistic attitude of Prussia, that also had not many other choices, right? And this derived by the edge that we have seen, given by the so-called negative purpose. Here, the Prussians had a so-called negative purpose because they weren't planning of conquering Austria, of conquering Russia. They couldn't. But in this sense, the positive object of the Austrians, of the Prussians, of the French, was wiping out Prussia by invading it, etc., was nullified, or at least was excuse me, at the end of the war, that, as we have seen, mostly happened for, had this outcome for certain reasons that were military, especially on other fields. Obviously, also the Prussians obtained important victories that are obtained through that particular defense, and also in the case of Russia, the succession, the election of Tsar Peter III, that was kind of a Prussian sympathizer, etc. But let's set aside this, that there was an intrinsic edge given that was a relative factor. It was determining, not decisive, for Prussia to prevent to save Prussia from annihilation in that case, right? So this is a kind of a very very good example drawn from military history that in fact illustrates now what von Clausewitz is saying beautifully, and the author goes on and says, but after his Frederick's skillful application of the system of husbanding his resources had shown the powers allied against him through a 7 years struggle that the actual expenditure of strength far exceeding what they had at first anticipated, they made peace. So here he adds another sort of reflection that is, basically saying that the enemies of Prussia had kind of overestimated their, let's say actually underestimated, in the sense, the expenditure of strength, right, that they would have had to exert against Prussia. At least previously to what they had anticipated. Previously, it's like, like World War I. Everybody thought, all the powers that went to war in 1914 thought that war would have been over in 2 or 3 months before the autumn leaves fall, right? And so it wasn't, evidently. So that also had, in that case, in special particular moment in history with trench warfare, that is obviously a kind of a position war, so it's based on a kind of a defensive ground because of certain technological reasons that at that time had brought the battlefields to shape in that fashion. And that's, incidentally, these are all examples that show what we were telling before, that is, the greatest mistakes in general are relative to this kind of calculation. That is the let's say the underestimation of the strengths to exert from the attacker's side while attacking a defender, right? And yeah, so naturally historical examples are kind of complicated. We had to digress a little bit, but still the point is very clear, and they prove you how they effectively happen, right? Then von Clausewitz goes on and says, we see then that there are many ways to one's object in war, that the complete subjugation of the enemy is not essential in every case. So this is clear. You don't need really to completely subjugate the enemy, nor to completely annihilate him. That's not the object, not even in the abstract form of war. I mean, yeah, the complete subjugation is, but nothing else. You don't have to really kill him. Not necessarily, at least. You have just to oblige him to fulfill your will. You have to compel him to fulfill your will. That's it. Whichever your will is, though, so you realize how the relative element is always out there. So the author goes on and says that the destruction of the enemy's military force, the conquest of the enemy's provinces, the mere occupation of them, the mere invasion of them, enterprises which are aimed directly at political objects, lastly, a passive expectation of the enemy's blow, are all means, each in itself, may be used to force the enemy's will according as the peculiar circumstances of the case lead us to expect more from the one or the other, right? So yeah, this is clear, I think, right? So here it's simply saying it all depends on what the circumstances are. You don't really need to completely subjugate an enemy to obtain what your political object is. You can play on different levels. Given your means, the ones of the enemy, what's the object, the same, the peculiar circumstances of the case, right? And it has to do obviously on what you expect also to gain, because most of the times actually you'll have options on the table. I mean, especially from a strategical point of view. So, and bigger decisions, it's all the more complicated in many ways. I mean, you have to think it twice before embarking yourself in just, overthrowing a regime or invading that country or doing, making someone else attack. I mean, those are things you always have on the table and you have to choose among them. So you have to try to calculate at least the probabilities that thing will go for the right verse, right? Then here von Clausewitz says another very important thing that is quite theoretical, but it's crucial also to understand much of how this decision which just mentioned really is taken. Says we could still add to these a whole category of shorter methods of gaining the end, which might be called arguments ad hominem. So here is saying basically, now we will see. You can all have ad hominem, that is by each thinking for head's perspective, a way to attain that end, right? So here von Clausewitz is saying, I'm not going to tell you how to do it. We could even make a list of ways you can effectively achieve the result of making the enemy obeying to your will, but what would serve to? Because here it says, what branch of human affairs is there in which these sparks of individual spirit have not made their appearance surmounting all formal considerations? And least of all, can they fail to appear in war where the personal character of the combatants plays such an important part, both in the cabinet and in the field? We limit ourselves to pointing this out, as it would be pedantry to attempt to reduce such influences into classes. That is, in any real, you can't really make a case for every single idea, plan, action that has ever been taken. step by step, because where would you begin, and especially when would you stop at the end, because this is not important. What we need is to get the essentials. Then how to get those essentials will be observed in maybe even later, because partly obviously there is an attention to kind of smaller elements, but here other classes are not important as such. We limit ourselves to point this out by now, and says that in fact, including these classes, we may say that the number of possible ways of reaching the object rises to infinity. So in fact it would be kind of endless, right? Then it says in conclusion, we're approaching the conclusion at least, to avoid underestimating these different short roads to one's purpose, either estimating them all only as rare exceptions, or holding the difference which they cause in the conduct of war as insignificant, we must bear in mind the diversity of political objects which may cause a war. As always, war is nothing but a political instrument, and nothing else. War is a political act, and it's also an act of violence. But it all depends on the political objects, right? And it's just a me. So you can't tell to, there is no way to categorize all the infinite possibilities that can bring a war to be fought, and pretending you have to come to an end to that, because it's simply impossible, and much of Vom Kriege's effort is directly aimed exactly at making you spot that it's basically impossible to approach this positivistically, for there is no science of war but just an art, so that there are better certain things you have to bear in mind on how to conduct your inquiry, to clarify your path, not really telling you how you have to walk and what you have to do along the way, because that's only upon to you, and as much as the political objects are concerned. Everyone has its own reason to start a war, and here von Clausewitz is not interested to tell you, it's your business, and it's really how it is, even in reality. So it's an influence to our purpose now. And here it says, measure at a glance the distance which there is between a death struggle for political existence and a war which a forged or tottering alliance makes a matter of disagreeable duty, right? So he says you can be fighting to cause or to prevent actually annihilation, right? So a death struggle of political existence, right? A state that is fighting for its own survival, or a war that basically you're brought into just because there is a kind of a weird system of alliances that bring you to do it, even if you don't actually give a damn about it, because it's merely political. The reason why you're there is merely political, and you would have not had any other kind of military nuisance, which is also relative, because it's very difficult at that point to understand in a finite world how not caring about what is happening elsewhere is an intelligent thing to do, because after all we are particularly we could always be next. You may never know what the future holds, let's say, and there are also here several historical examples of such events, but here it says it doesn't matter. The war range is too wide, right? There can be different wars in the sense that they can be kind of more political, more military wars, but at the end of the day, these relations that we had, these ways of defeating an enemy are responding to certain dynamics, to certain axioms that then you have to calibrate according to the circumstances. but as long as you know that there are those laws, right? And in conclusion, he says, aside from, he says, between the two innumerable gradations occur in practice, so obviously that's what we just said, there are infinite possibilities, and he says, if we reject one of these gradations in theory, we might with equal right reject the whole, which would be tantamount to shutting the real world completely out of sight. This is also a very strong phrase that is legitimately strong because it's very meaningful. It says, if you think that from this range of options you can say, oh well, this will never happen, then you're not talking about reality. Because you could always find yourself and especially in war, more than in any other human activity, in conditions that you had completely not even expected most of the times. And I would add in this sense that it's a bit like the study of military history. Probably military history is the social science that makes you understand way more than you could ever possibly believe to be true. And other fields, other topics, other branches do not have this capacity. They not have this ability. So it's very meaningful. It's something that war that obviously now, fortunately, at least from some perspective, we can watch from the relative distance and say, oh wow, I'm lucky that I'm not in there. But if you think that it's gonna stay like that forever, or you're just making a deep mistake, because it could as well happen that maybe you in your lifetime you will never, hopefully, I wish it to you, especially if you're a good person, you will never see what a war is. But you also, by lowering the guard, by discarding that option, you're kind of growing weaker, so that maybe if you pass on your experience, your views, your attitude towards your children or grandchildren, and you think that they will never have to face what our grandfathers or great grandfathers faced on the battlefields of Europe or wherever they fought. Well, I believe that you're doing something very bad. I mean, from a civical and moral point of view, you're putting at risk a civilization in many ways. So, von Clausewitz, I remember this all the times. I reminded this all the times that he's writing after a war that had devastated his own home, his own homeland, and that actually, war, let's say, would not be really something very far from Germany for too long, historically speaking, after von Clausewitz's times. So this is all the more meaningful because he evidently wrote this work to warn not just the Prussians in that case for what he was concerned nationally speaking, but everyone, as a general treatise on war that takes into consideration war as not the war of one people, of one time, of one history. Von Clausewitz is none of that. Von Clausewitz talks about war as it is and will always be in every single moment of humanity. Because this has nothing to do with the technology you find it, the way, the place where you're fighting. It's always like this. And that's why it's so important, so fascinating, by the way, just from an intellectual point of view, because he really portrays your war in a way that it's not intuitive. It's actually, largely counterintuitive, I believe, but it is really the real one as it is. Naturally, this is not just a matter of intellectual exercise, in order to understand it, but it concerns even your cultural perception of war, culturally broadly meant. And if you look around yourself, I believe today, how many people do you know that, let's leave aside the note von Clausewitz is in the first place, but who actually, have a kind of a realistic grasp of, not even of war in itself, but of politics, for instance. It's very difficult, it's very complicated, that gives you the magnitude of the difficulties, of the strife that it takes to come to, if only to approach certain topics like we are trying to do on Schwerpunkt. So, alright, for today I think it's everything, and I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested to my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.